Welcome to the One Shot Show where GMs go to level up. I'm Patty. I'm joined as always by Matt. And today we're asking the question, what is official anyway? As we go out there into the world as GMs to source for our games, where are we looking? And then how do we assess the validity of what we're choosing to include in the game?
Right. Now, see, I thought when you were asking me that, like, are we going to be official?
Are we official at this point?
I mean, we've been doing this for a while together. I
True.
don't know how
We're like
you
3
feel.
or 4 months in.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's around the point, I think, where you you take that next step with someone.
That's nice.
But it's
Queen keys the place.
Yeah. But no, it's a very interesting question, and the reason I think it's interesting is because off the cuff, it seems very obvious. Well, take a system, look at material that is published by its the owner of the IP or whoever has the license. That's official. Anything else, not official. However, there are degrees of not official all the way up to a level of sheen and polish and production value that is oftentimes an equivalent level of what the official products are, and to be honest, with some systems out there, sometimes more so. So it's a really interesting question to ask. So look, we'll start from that point of official. Strictly speaking,
We'll start at the top of our ladder.
well,
technically.
I was going to say I'll define that, and then we can work our way upwards.
Awesome.
So the official, strictly speaking, is anything created and published and distributed by the owner of an IP in the TTRPG space. Or whoever has licensed the IP in the instance of, something like a Star Wars system or the Fallout role-playing system, for example. There's often a licensing element with the publisher to that product. D&D is the obvious one to look at. It's owned by Wizards of the Coast, who are in turn owned by Hasbro. Used to be owned by TSR, Technical Standard Rules. They got bought out by Wizards of the Coast when they went under. In any case, anything published by any of those companies for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is 100% official content. They are even very clear when something is not official content. Like, for example, when they release their Unearthed Arcana playtest content.
Yes.
They go, this is released by us, but it is not the final finished product. You are under no obligation to try and include this in your games. This is not officially published material. Let's go all the way down to the bottom to the most unofficial thing you can find.
I would count that as, well, what would you count it as?
I was going to say, that's one of two things. That's either something that your DM came up with that sucks. Something they came up with that's good is, that's a few runs
little tears up.
Something they came up with that sucks, or the classic, D&D wiki, the Kitsune meets Goku class.
That is kind of like, actually, look at it, this Ancestry looks more like a class in terms of the amount of detail that's put into it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember, I don't come up against those sites as often as I used to when I was starting out
Not
GMing.
anymore, no.
But I remember being deeply confused as a starting out GM, going I can't quite tell at this point what this is. Because even at that point, sites like D&D Beyond, they were the official partnered site with Wizards, but they weren't owned by Wizards at that point either.
And that doesn't strike you as any more or less official than something called D&D Wiki, for example. But anyone can submit to that, and many people do, and I don't think I've even seen something good on it.
No.
Is the thing. It's not even 80-20, where 80% of it is absolute slop and 20% of it's actually pretty good. The 20% isn't even on there. The 20%, the actual good stuff, immediately you're filtering out towards platforms like DM's Guild, Drive-Thru-RPG, etc., which kind of brings us to, I think, the lowest rung that you might actually want to grab hold of, which is essentially independently created third-party content that people are self-producing and self-publishing.
Yeah.
This, for example, is where I sit. I have made this kind of content before. I've made, custom classes, custom subclasses, new player options and spells, and I have released that as a paid downloadable PDF product. It can be custom adventures, it can be entire setting guides, anything that you might make yourself. And really, for me, that was, I wanted to create this cool thing for my game. And it got to the point where it was so developed and so sophisticated, I went, I might as well put this up for public release.
Yeah.
Why not? Make it cost $3, see if anyone's interested. And a few people were.
The big question for that crossover point for me because I also go there. I often I go to the DMs Guild. I go to Drive-Thru RPG a lot. I'll read what's on there. I'll look at how it's produced. I'll often look for like what the play testing on it is, which is I think the other big thing for me when I go for anything that is not official. I go like, is there some sort of track record that the author can speak to of how this was play tested, where it was played? Has it been stress tested?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And anything that sort of sits in that echelon is very much buyer beware. That's kind of how it works.
Yeah.
And you're right. Therefore, as the buyer, you're often doing more due diligence than you might do with something a bit higher up the rungs. And it's interesting you mention playtesting and also sort of track record. Often in that space, there's particular individuals who might be known for producing somewhat consistent output within the particular scenes that they're in or the systems that they tend to make things for. And people tend to trend towards those things. The community as a whole is generally pretty good at kind of filtering out the stuff that's absolutely crap and getting a good feel for what's actually interesting and worth bringing into your games.
Though I will say the search tools on side GM's Guild and Drive-Thru RPG are sometimes not intuitive toward that.
No, that's why it's easier to often know a creator and actually track them elsewhere online through their socials or through other places where they maybe post and share their content, where they'll often then be linking to its page on something like Drive-Thru RPG or DM's Guild. Quick asterisk on playtesting, by the way. I am stunned how much third-party content is released by, shall we say, generally lauded members of the homebrewing community. And I actually think that's really the word we ought to use here. This is where we're not so much third-party content, we're on homebrew.
We're like on really well-produced homebrew that you'd be happy to lay down some dollars for.
I'm stunned how many people in that space do not playtest, and I think it shows. And it's quite disappointing. And I'm also personally of the opinion that that's actually what holds that back from going any further up the rung. Because any further up the rung, when you're getting into third-party publishing, it requires a little bit more rigor, usually because there's a greater financial entanglement. There's often printing and publishing costs because they may in fact be physical copies. And you must playtest. I want to be clear. There is nothing that is a substitute for playtesting. I don't care how many times you've posted it online for feedback. I don't care how much white room math you've done. Unless you have put it in a session and actually run it and tried it, playtesting will... not playtesting will always sell you short, and it's for a very simple reason. Perfect balance does not equal fun. It might be fun, but you would not believe the number of times I've thrown $1 or $2 to something interesting looking on DM's Guild, and what comes out is a fairly well-regarded, very finely tuned, boring piece of content because they haven't put it in front of players who can very immediately go, okay, this isn't actually very fun.
Yeah, I mean, even some pieces of third-party content that are quite widely out there. The one I always think of is the Blood Hunter. Have you had a player or played yourself a Blood Hunter?
I have played one, yeah.
And I never have much fun with it. And it's so interesting to me that it's out there. It's now so high up. And I've had 2 players that have played. I myself have played. I've pivoted off onto another class. And it's that fun factor that comes through for me. It's kind of like I don't take much joy in the playing of it. And it's because there's something in the mechanics that is not working for the joy or the fantasy of the class.
It feels like you spend a whole hell of a lot of time not quite getting to do the thing that you feel you're supposed to be good at. Whereas the rogue walks up, they get sneak attack, they roll a whole bunch of dice. It's instant, right? Yeah. And I mean, look, I could rattle off a handful of examples. There's a particular one that I always come back to. It was a gentleman who had made a bard subclass, and this thing delivered a fairly significant amount of power in its kit to someone else. They themselves got to do very little. And I was trying to give this particular creator some feedback in saying, I think the problem you're going to have here is, they don't really get to do additional attacks and things like that, despite being more melee and not, and all these particular things. And they kept coming back to how perfectly balanced and finely tuned it was. And they were completely right. But I eventually had to just sort of say my piece and walk away from it and go, The problem is you set your passive ability up and then you do nothing on every single one of your subsequent turns while giving someone else a lot of power. That's not fun. It already sucks. The worst part of most RPGs usually is waiting for your turn to come around when you finally get to do your stuff. If you don't even have stuff to do on your turn, never going to be fun. Doesn't matter how well tuned, doesn't matter how exciting the fantasy of it is, it will never be fun.
Yeah, passivity is a great there are so many amazing passives that you can build into a mechanic. But as a player, it's not like a cool thing in a video game where you watch it clicking over and it's giving you your benefits.
Yeah.
You just say it, it happens, and then it passively exists there without a dice roll attached to it very, very often.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's, again, my fantasy begins to die as I play the game. Yeah.
Let's go next up the rung, and we've already kind of flirted with this, and this is where we get into what we call third-party content. This is where you usually get here by ascending from homebrew. You are creating something that is a little bit more official. You've got maybe a little bit more backing around it. You may have print-on-demand options. This is where I would say something like Strongholds and Followers exists for those who are familiar with 5th edition. Now, since the moment where that was created and released, MCDM's publishing operation has since become more sophisticated and gone the next rung up the ladder, in my honest opinion. But at this point in time, it's that third party. It's like I said, it's an independent person who's kind of taken that next step, or maybe a group of people who have taken that next step upwards. And there's a very thin line between that and the next rung up, which is where you start to see things like Kobold Press.
Yeah.
So you start to run into third-party publishers that are themselves quite well-established businesses whose entire business is creating third-party content for multiple tabletop systems, usually whichever is going to be the most popular, because that's where they're going to sell the most products. That's now where I would say MCDM's publishing house has started to move up to, especially with Draw Steel in the works. But that's sort of your next rung up of what you could call official. And that's why I bring up MCDM particularly, is in the context of Strongholds and Followers, we would unambiguously say that is not official content. But the publishing house, they've got their own system now. That is official content as far as anyone's concerned, because they are the IP holder of that. So do we say that that publisher is more or less official? Is Strongholds and Followers now more official than it used to be because this entity is now sophisticated enough to have its own IP with its own discrete system that it runs under its own steam? It's a really interesting thing to think about, because in my honest opinion, yes, that does make Strongholds and Followers feel a bit more official than it used to be. Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide was outsourced to a third party. You would say that that is equally as official, quote unquote, as, say, Xanathar's Guide to Everything. In reality, it was produced by a completely different company, and a lot of people remark on the difference in quality.
Oh, yeah. So I don't know any... I've never... Is there any subclass in Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide that has had its long-term due at a table?
I feel like one or two did get tweaked and re-released, but I couldn't remember them off the top of my head.
They've recently released new edition versions of some of them.
Right, yep.
Sorry, I got distracted. Back to your point about, it's hard to tell the line now. A lot of MCDM, they now have their monster book and one of their classes up on D&D Beyond.
Yep.
That third-party gap is, even closer. They are supported on the official platform as a third-party source. And to create some of the best monsters, some of the best... the Illrigger is a fantastically evocative subclass.
Very
that is
flavorful, yeah. And I mean, a similar example would be Darrington Press,
yes.
right? So if you go way back to... there was a Taldore Adventurer's Guide, a setting guide. It was fine. I would say it was a bit below the quality of what I might expect from a quote-unquote official publisher.
Yeah. It didn't look the same as you stared at the pictures and went,
but then Critical Role has become big enough and so ubiquitous enough that then the Explorer's Guide to Wildmount was released, which is 100% unequivocally an official Wizards of the Coast Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition product. But it's based entirely on a third-party setting IP with a lot of third-party content in there in terms of subclasses and things like that then have sort of gone through the extra level of rigor of working with Wizards of the Coast's designs team. Rigor in air quotes there. But then also Darrington Press, again, like MCDM, they've released their own fully fledged independent system. You would, in no uncertain terms, say that Daggerheart is an official product from an IP owner and publisher.
Written by, and now two of their key designers and writers were the key designers and writers for 5th edition, Jeremy Crawford and Chris Perkins. Before we finish in our last minute, what are your favorite third party, your favorite unofficial, official things that you either grab from or that you in the past have really, really loved?
I've got a real spicy one here. Technically, by a lot of the definitions we've laid out, Pathfinder is an unofficial product, right? And there is a very simple reason for that. Brief history lesson. It is because it originally was built on the Open Game License, the OGL. The entirety of Pathfinder First Edition and initially Pathfinder Second Edition were built off the Third Edition Open Game License, which meant that was technically, at the time, slightly less official than a mainline D&D product. That existed so that anyone could release content, third-party content, for Dungeons & Dragons at the time, 3rd edition. There wasn't really a consideration that might actually spawn whole spin-off systems like what Pathfinder was. And the 1st edition of Pathfinder was a lot more similar to 3.5 than what Pathfinder 2nd edition is to anything. But Pathfinder 2nd edition started on that exact same open game license. So how official would we call that? Well, Paizo own the IP, it's their own product, and now they've actually spun off their own game license because of the OGL scandal. They went, that's no longer a secure foundation. They entirely have their own thing. But the genesis of that started in a very unofficial place, but probably the most sophisticated version of what we would technically call unofficial, which is where I say the line gets blurred. Because I think you would be ridiculous to actually imply that Pathfinder is not an official product in any way, shape, or form. But by the definitions we've laid out, my big twist ending is my favorite unofficial Dungeons & Dragons product is Pathfinder 2nd Edition.
This is the One Shot Show podcast. We'll see you next time. Thanks.
If you're enjoying listening to the One Shot Show, why not support us on Patreon? Go to patreon.com/OneShotShow, where you'll be able to find video versions of our episodes, long-form bonus episodes that we release every single month, access to our community Discord server. You can pose questions for our special Q&A episodes, and if you're back at the higher tiers, you can even vote on what questions we cover in our show. Check it out.